Welcome everybody to White Cloak's Real Ratings. As always, this data is the official Nielsen data. This is legitimate as it gets with no corporate spin on it. The trade-off for that legitimacy is that it comes out about a month late. So this is the data for August 29th to September 4th. Well, the ratings are here for Rings of Power premiere week, and the show premiered with a very impressive 1.25 billion minutes streamed. Already, Variety and a handful of other access media sites are trying to spin the numbers in order to crown Rings of Power as something that it's not. So let's talk about what these figures actually mean. The first thing you have to understand is that Nielsen streaming ratings aren't at all like Nielsen TV ratings. Nielsen TV used to report on how many viewers watched a specific episode, and they still do that for regular TV, but their streaming numbers work very differently. Nielsen streaming only records how many minutes of an entire show is streamed from one Monday to Sunday period. It has no data based on specific episodes, and it only shows the top 10 for that week. This creates a system where the total amount of content drives totals. That's why you're seeing Game of Thrones still riding in at the number 2 spot. Nielsen also doesn't catalog the data, so if you miss the data for that week, you're out of luck. Long story short, it makes comparing numbers very difficult and opens the door for corporations to spin them in various ways. As an example, if you wanted to seriously detract from House of the Dragon, you could say that House of the Dragon was so unpopular that it didn't even make the top 10 in the week that it premiered. What that doesn't take into account is that House of the Dragon premiered on Sunday at 9 p.m., only 3 hours before the weekly reset. In that 3 hours, it recorded 347 million minutes, which is a massively impressive achievement, even though it didn't make that top 10, going against shows that premiered entire 8-week seasons for the entire week. Nielsen reported last week that House of the Dragon was viewed for 741 million minutes over 2 episodes, but what that fails to account for is that the second episode was only available for 3 hours in that weekly recording period. It would be far more accurate to say that it was 741 million minutes across one episode, even if that tiny little 3-hour overhang of the second episode is included. Rings of Power in its premiere week brings an additional level of complexity to this comparison because it dropped 2 episodes on a Thursday. Simply dividing the total minutes by 2 to account for each episode would lead to the conclusion that the show was watched for 625 million minutes per episode, which is about 25% lower than House of the Dragon on a per episode basis. However, that fails to take into account that the show dropped on a Thursday and would likely pick up some additional viewership minutes on the Monday through Wednesday period of that week, even though viewership does tend to be front-loaded towards the premiere days. To make a long story short, deciding the winner between Rings of Power and House of the Dragon will need to wait at least one more week, and probably more like 3 weeks. Regardless of all that backlog, the number 1 spot goes to Rings of Power, which racked up 1.25 billion minutes over the 4 days and 2 episodes. I suspect Rings of Power will hold the number 1 spot next week, with around 900 million minutes, pending a surprise Netflix premiere. The numbers for Rings of Power should follow Wheel of Time in that the total will fall as there's fewer minutes available, but they will get an improvement in the per premiere minutes from people catching up who missed the opening weeks. The number 2 spot for this week was held by Game of Thrones, which dropped from 909 million minutes to 792 million minutes. HBO has to be thrilled out of their mind at the revival of Game of Thrones, especially considering that HBO hasn't had a non-Game of Thrones affiliated show make the streaming top 10 this year. The number 3 spot was held by House of the Dragon, which jumped up from 741 million minutes to 781 million minutes. It's hard to tell if this is a typical week 2 catch-up bump or if House of the Dragon is building viewership week over week. Regardless, not having any drop-off at all is impressive. It's also worth noting that House of the Dragon lost viewers over cable, with the on-air falling from 2.26 million viewers to 1.75 million viewers. The streaming gain more than makes up for the cable loss, and it makes you wonder if we're seeing people transition to HBO Max from HBO. I would expect to see another gain in minutes next week in streaming as the cable numbers improved by 11% from week to week. The number 4 spot went to Netflix's Devil in Ohio with 716 million minutes. All 8 episodes dropped on Friday, September 2nd. While this probably wasn't the premiere that Netflix was looking for, it's distinctly possible that a week 2 bump puts it up even as high as the number 1 spot next week. The number 5 spot went to Stranger Things with 667 million minutes. That's down from 890 in previous weeks. The show probably has 2 to 3 more weeks in the top 10 and could break 25 billion in the top 10 since I've been recording weekly. That's an absolutely wild achievement. The number 6 spot went to Echoes, which fell from number 1 last week. It added another 627 million minutes, bringing its total up to 2.27 billion. If it makes the top 10 next week, it will likely break the 2.5 billion minute barrier. The number 7 spot went to Netflix's I Am a Killer, which earned 558 million minutes in its premiere week. This is another strong candidate for a bump into the top 5 in its second week. Netflix continues to do extremely well with its true crime premieres. The number 8 spot went to She-Hulk with a not unimpressive 472 million minutes. It's still punching well below the rest of the MCU shows, but even with 6 episodes left, it's only got 51 million minutes fewer than Marvel provided in its entire weeks. If She-Hulk can hold on to about 400 million minutes weekly, Marvel will consider themselves lucky. The number 9 spot went to The Sandman with 432 million minutes. It will likely exit the top 10 after this week, but with 4.46 billion minutes, the upcoming cancellation will be tough to swallow for fans of the show. The number 10 spot went to Virgin River with 428 million minutes. If it holds on for one more week, it will break 9 billion minutes, which will make Netflix very happy. The number 11 spot went to Netflix's Partner Track with 413 million minutes. It premiered last Friday and didn't make that week's top 10. Another 400 million minute week next week is likely possible, which would bring it up to 800 million, but that'll be a disappointing run for Netflix. The last spot on the list goes to Untold, which is down to 301 from 480 million the week previously. That brings its total viewership in the top 10 up to 1.4 billion. Considering there's only 2 hours of content, Netflix has to be thrilled out of their mind with the viewership. To wrap up the week, if you came in expecting to see a clear winner declared between House of the Dragon and Rings of Power, you probably left disappointed. This will be the closest watched ratings battle in a decade, so I'll continue to follow up closely.